Hello? This is on. Hey everybody, let's try to file in pretty quickly and have your seat so we can get going. I know that everybody is extremely well rested because there's nothing to do in Lisbon, so you've all been just up very early waiting to get going this morning. Okay, excellent. We're very excited to kick off the Saturday session. So this morning we have session 6 on decision making. And let's please welcome Raj Rao from the University of Washington.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. And congratulations on the 20th anniversary. I remember back in the early 2000s when I was in a workshop at NeurIPS, and we were discussing, Cosyne, and we were thinking about the name, and there was some debate about should we name it Cosyne, or is that too geeky of a name? But I'm glad we stuck with it. And it's 20 years now, and it's wonderful to see the audience. We used to have a few hundred people, but now it's 1,000 some. So that's wonderful to see the community growing this well. I'd like to dedicate this talk to Dana Ballard, who passed away a little over a year ago. And he was a wonderful mentor, a great researcher, and also a wonderful human being. So he'll be missed. When I was working with Dana in the 1990s as a graduate student, this was our model of what neural networks were all about, right? So 3 layers is all you need, riffing on the attention paper. Basically the idea was, that you could do pretty much with three layers because there's a universal approximation theorem that given enough hidden neurons in the hidden layer, you can pretty much approximate any function, right? And here's what it looks like today, right? So today, of course, we have transformers, we have deep networks, many layers, billions of parameters, and of course, to go along with that, tons of data all over the internet. And if you look at how these kinds of networks are trained, especially large language models like ChatGPT, there's 2 different main components, right, in terms of the training. One is the fact that the metric, the goal that you're using here, as was mentioned by Blaise yesterday, is prediction, right? So you're trying to predict the next token, you're trying to predict the next word. So to take a sentence from the Cosyne mission, right? If there's a sentence that ends in to understand how neural systems blank, right? What would you predict? Function, right? So it could be work or function, right? So there are these statistical patterns that it learns, and that's what these networks are doing. And the other interesting thing is that the way that you train these networks is by looking at errors or mismatches, right? So prediction errors are also a very important component. Here we're using it to train the networks through backpropagation. Now, if you look at what happens in our traditional textbook models of visual perception, cognition, and action, it's this very sequential sort of bucket brigade type of set of processing, right? Serial processing, which is we say, okay, there's perception that happens at the back of our heads, and then there's a decision-making process or cognition that happens in the frontal parts, and then there's action, right, that happens in the middle parts, right? So this is sort of the traditional feed-forward model, but this is at odds with the kinds of anatomy that you see in the cortex, right? The idea that pretty much every feed-forward connection between a couple of cortical areas is reciprocated by feedback connections, as shown in this review by Gilbert and Lee. So back in the late 1990s, working with Dana Ballard, and inspired by people like David Mumford and David Mackay and others, we suggested this model called predictive coding, which is the idea that if you can use the feedback connections to convey top-down expectations or predictions, then you can use the feed-forward pathways to convey the error signal. And doing that, you could do inference. So this would be a Bayesian model. So you have priors that are being conveyed through predictions, and then you can update the state estimates at every level in a network through the prediction errors, right? So you're doing inference, Bayesian inference through this kind of a mechanism here. And the idea was perhaps you could correlate the feedback connections with predictions or expectations and feed forward conveying the error signals. And we extended this to a hierarchy to start to explain some of the contextual or extra-classical receptive field effects that were observed at the time in the visual cortex. And this was the idea. The idea was that every cortical area may have its own estimate of the state of the world, and it's trying to make predictions about what's happening in a different cortical area. So in this case, a hierarchical kind of a prediction of what's happening in an area that's lower level of the hierarchy. And as you go towards the higher levels, you have increasingly abstract representation. So because you have prediction errors at every level, you don't have to use backprop. You can use local prediction errors to change the weights and learn models at different levels of abstraction. And you get the different levels of abstraction because you have convergence. So you get bigger spatial receptive fields as you go up the network in this particular way. So there's been a lot of interest in predictive coding. So you can see that there's been tons of work, especially by a group of people, including Kristen and others, and lots of books that have come out. And there's a lesson to be learned here, right? So what do you think the lesson is? Look on the left side, right? So it was about 10 years, right? And there's nothing. There's no citations at all. There's no interest in the article. So the lesson to the grad students and postdocs is don't lose hope if you are not getting cited, because there may be light at the end of the tunnel, right? You just have to give it enough time, wait, and perhaps the ideas will get picked up at some point in time. So this particular model was interesting. There's a lot of interest, but it's missing a really important part of perception, which is what? So, and here's a bee image. So I think given the amazing talk that opened this conference by Lars, I think every Cosyne talk needs to have a slide on bees. So here's my bee slide. And what you notice here is these eye movements, right? Saccades. There are about 3 per second. And so what you really get, or what you would get, is the fovea moving around. So the visual information is not a snapshot, as one might think in terms of a camera, but it's these glimpses, right? Glimpses of the world that are being sent to the higher areas of the visual system. And this was noticed by Yarbus back in the 1960s. So perception is not static, right? That's one of the big take-home messages here. It involves different kinds of movements. So eye movements is one prominent visual way of sampling the world. There's also head movements, body movements, and so on, right? So there's been recent results that also seem to indicate that actions are extremely important all across cortex, not just in the motor cortex or in the frontal lobe, but throughout all the different areas, right? So this was an interesting experiment by Zetka House in 2021, published in 2021, showing that, oh, that's interesting, showing that you basically, if you have a task that has discrimination between 2 stimuli, as shown on the left-hand side, even before there is actual action being undertaken, you can decode correlates of that action all across the cortex, right? So it's almost like the entire cortex is carrying information about the cortex, and this happens even before the action is executed. So one particular hypothesis there is that perhaps impending action affects all of cortex in terms of perhaps a predictive updating of the cortical representations, saying that, hey, I'm about to make a movement, update your representations at different levels of your cortical representation. So that's one particular idea that one could explore here. There's another kind of hint you get from the neuroanatomy. So this is something that was that's been noticed by many people, including Murray Sherman and others, which is that even primary sensory cortical areas send outputs to motor areas. So, for example, V1, primary visual cortex, sends outputs from the deeper layers, layer 5, to superior colliculus. The auditory cortex, A1, sends information to the inferior colliculus. There's outputs to the basal ganglia. S1, right, primary somatosensory cortex, sends information to the spinal cord, right? And similarly, there's also the primary motor cortex receives sensory information. It's not just purely motor. It receives sensory information in the superficial layers. So if you look at the 6-layered architecture of the cortex, you can see sensory inputs coming in to the middle layers. There's processing here, and then there's outputs that are going down from the deeper layers, especially layer 5 to subcortical motor centers. So the question is why? So why is it that even we were brought up to believe that there's this separation of sensory and motor, nice clean separation. There's posterior parts of the brain that are processing only sensory information, and then there's nice separation of the motor system in the frontal lobe. Why is this mixing potentially going on, right? And so if you look at the way that people in control theory and AI are trying to solve this problem, you'll see this kind of a picture in pretty much all textbooks for control theory and reinforcement learning, which is that there's a world out there. Here's an agent you basically have sampling of the world by the agent. So based on the movements we looked at, the sensory sampling in terms of eye movements and head movements and body movements. And then there's 2 different components you typically see. One is a state transition function, or the dynamics of the world. So this is the model of how the world changes as a consequence of your actions, right? So this is the dynamics of how the world evolves. Some people like to call that the physics of the world, right? And then there's another component which is called the policy function, or the inverse model. And this basically is saying, given a particular state that my model is predicting, what is the best thing to do, right? What's the action that I can take? And once you take the action, you can get a different state of the world, and that in turn is estimated by the agent, right? So you have these 2 components that are pretty standard in most models, and this can be a Markov model, which is it takes the current state, current action, gives you the next state. And that's the traditional MDP model in reinforcement learning. It could be a POMDP, which is partially observable Markov decision process. In that case, you don't get the actual state of the world. You get a sensory observation, right? So you get it from your retinas, you get it from your ears, you get it from touch. And that is, in turn, allows you to estimate the state, the actual state or the hidden state of the world using your world model, right? So inspired by this particular kind of modeling of how you would make sense of the world and take actions of the world, we were trying to fit that into the laminar architecture of the cortex in general, right? So if you think about it in terms of the architecture that you see here, right? So here's the, if you look at the visual areas, for example, lower order thalamus is the inputs, and you can see that they go into the middle layers. And then there is also internal intracortical circuitry here. So you have the middle layers going to the superficial layers going back down to the deeper layers, and there's feedback from the deeper layers going back to the superficial layers. So there's this recurrent circuitry almost here from the superficial to deep and back to the superficial. And then there's inputs and outputs also, right? From the thalamus going into the deeper layers, from the higher order thalamus going to the superficial, and so on, right? So, and as we mentioned, there's also motor outputs to subcortical centers from the layer 5 and deeper layers, right? So one suggestion is that, and this is the active predictive coding model. So this is the idea that you could have the state transition function and the policy functions both implemented within cortical areas, right? So let's think about that a little bit. So if you have something like a state transition model, this is the predictive model, right? So if you look at the traditional predictive coding, the idea was that there's a previous state predicting the next state. Now you also have actions, right? So you have state and action predicting the next state. And then that in turn gives rise to a predicted action as well. So here's a policy function that predicts what the next action should be. And you can have this loop going on. And this, in turn, generates a bunch of inputs or predicted inputs and a bunch of actions, right? So this is basically what is called a generative model in the Bayesian sense of the world. So in a Bayesian model, you always have a generative model. And in this case, the generative model gives you both states and actions, right? And the challenge is, given a generative model, how do you invert it, right? So how do you estimate the states, and how do you estimate the actions, right? And of course, the longer-term problem is, how do you learn the state transition function? This is the predictive model of the world. And how do you learn these policy functions? And those are the two inference and learning problems that you have to solve if you have a generative model of the world, right? So basically, this is the underlying module, right, you can think about if you believe that there is both sensory and motor interactions going on within cortical areas. So that's one suggestion here. And then I talked about inference. So how do you do inference? So if you go back to how you would do inference in a Kalman filter or in the predictive coding model, you could use predictions of the world with your state transition model to get prediction errors. So that's the prediction errors here. And that can be used to update your state estimate, right? So this S hat over here is your best estimate of the state. And then this A hat over here is your best estimate of what action is best in the current situation, right? And of course, you have to learn these two things. So there's these hats over here saying that this has to be learned. The state transition model has to be learned, and the action function also has to be learned, right? So that's one idea here, is that you could have this loop going on that generates predictions as well as generates suggested actions for any particular situation. So what about the hierarchical structure? So I mentioned that there's this multiple cortical areas. So why do you have multiple cortical areas, and why are they structured in this particular way, especially in a hierarchy, right? So the computational motivation, this goes to Alex's talk yesterday, right? So Alex, here's compositionality. So if you think about how you would solve a complex problem like going to the grocery store, right? You would solve it according to some behaviors you've already learned, right? So for example, walking to the door, walking to your garage if you're going to drive, and then you get into the car, drive to the store, and so on. These are modules, or these are behavioral policies that you learned. And each of these can be decomposed into sub-policies, right, or sensory motor modules, and all the way up to, for example, opening the car door, closing the door, and so on for one particular higher level module. So you can imagine that this hierarchy is a way of managing the complexity of solving hard problems in the world, right? It has both dynamics, so you're simplifying the dynamics of how the car door opens and how it actually feels when you touch it and so on. That could be encompassed in the state transition hierarchy. And similarly, in terms of the policies, right? So there's something called options in reinforcement learning, in hierarchical reinforcement learning. That also fits in with this idea that you're trying to decompose a complex policy function into simpler ones, a sequence of simpler ones. So the policies and transition functions here, the world model is hierarchical, and they can be reused to solve other tasks. So that's the whole point of compositionality, is that you can reapply. For example, walking to the door, walking to the garage. If I want to go to work, I can do the same thing, right? If I'm going to the market, I'm going to a friend's house, I can reuse these policies for other tasks than going to the grocery store, okay? So how do you make this hierarchical, right? So this was the first level model that I talked about. If you recall the slide, that was a couple of slides away. You have states and actions predicting the next state. And then if you have the policy function here at that particular level, it gives you an action, right? It could depend on the previous action as well. But here, you'll notice I put two different subscripts for time. So t is some particular time interval. And tau minus 1 is the time interval in this particular level. So every level is going to have its own temporal scale, right? So as you go higher up, you're going to have longer and longer time scales, right? Which comes naturally from the fact that you have higher levels operating at different spatial and temporal abstractions. So here's the way you could structure this, right? So if every level has the same exact architecture, it has its own state transition model, it has its own policy function, then the higher level can operate in the same way. And the way it can influence the lower level is we suggest that it could be done through these top-down connections. So you have this network, HS, that takes the vector at the higher level. This is the state vector, here's the action vector. And it generates or modulates a whole function at the lower level. So I think this is the difference between the previous models of hierarchical predictive coding, which was predicting the state at the lower level. Here we're suggesting that the higher levels can modulate the actual dynamics, the recurrent dynamics of the lower levels themselves. And this turns out to be a very powerful way to solve computational problems or simplifying the complexity is you break it down into pieces and you have the higher levels generating lower level functions, okay? And so in AI, it's called hypernetworks. So hypernetworks in AI are networks that generate other neural networks. Obviously, the brain can't do that, but what the brain can do is modulate the dynamics or functions being computed at the lower level. Okay, and just to give you a take-home message here, higher levels, when they have complex dynamics and abstract actions being encoded, they simplify that into a sequence, which is given by this recurrent network that is giving you different states, as well as different actions, right? So you have states at the lower level at a smaller time scale being sequenced, as well as actions being sequenced, okay? And finally, how do you implement these top-down modulation of functions, right? So you cannot generate a whole neural network. So what you could do, there's two different ways. So one is you can use top-down contextual input. So you basically have an input, you can call that a task input, that is being fed as an additional input to a recurrent neural network, both for the states and the actions. And it's been shown to be equivalent to using hypernetworks by Galanti and Wolf on the AI literature. And then there's also work that has been done. For example, Yang et al. In Nature Neuroscience showed that you can use this kind of a model to change the dynamics and solve many different tasks. So I think Alex also used something like this model to show that you can solve multiple tasks by having a task input, essentially a vector that is kept constant as a rule input over here, right? A one-hot vector. Another way you can change the dynamics at a lower level or the function being computed is through gain modulation, right? So if you have the top-down inputs change the gain of neurons at the lower level, it can change what is being computed, as shown by Stroud et al., again in a Nature Neuroscience paper, showing that the gain of the input-output function changes when you have some different values for the gain, and that in turn changes the dynamics of what is being computed at the lower level. So two different ways in which higher levels can modulate the functions being computed at the lower level, and that is an important part of this architecture. All right, so I'll just take you through two different applications. So one application is vision, and then the other application is going to be navigation. So what you'll see here is that the same exact architecture, if you really believe that cortical areas are computing something similar across cortical areas, the same exact architecture can be used to solve a vision problem, as well as solve a navigation problem or a hierarchical planning problem, okay? So first application is vision. So in the case of vision, what you're trying to do is encode an object in terms of its parts, right? So when you make eye movements, you're scanning the object or a scene, and you're integrating that information over time, and that gives rise to a representation at the higher level of a state vector or a vector that captures all the parts of the object, right? And then the actions in this case encode where to look next. So depending on the task, if it's object recognition versus finding an object or making sense of the scene that is in front of me, there's going to be different policies, right? And that in turn dictates where I look next, or where I move my body, or where I move my head, right? So these are actions that you have to learn to make in order to satisfy the goals that you have. So here's an example of that. So if you have a two-level hierarchy, you can have a region being selected to analyze at the higher level. So this may be a larger spatial scale. In this case, it's a fixed size that we're scanning here in this really simple MNIST image. And then once you select a region, the lower level can then scan within that region, essentially dividing the complex problem of big scenes into focusing on smaller areas of the scene. And finally, at the lowest level, it's going to be scanning these little pieces of the image, right? And it's going to try to predict what that next image is going to be. So it's a predictive estimator, right? So it's predicting based on the state transition model, given the action, what is the next thing I'm going to see? So predicting the sensory consequence of its action. And how do you learn? So there's two different networks. So the state networks are going to learn by minimizing prediction error. So this is just self-supervised learning, similar to how transformers learn. The action networks can be trained in multiple ways. So one is reinforcement learning. So you can use reinforcement learning to maximize some reward function. Or you could also do planning. Because you have a model, you can do planning of what is going to happen if I execute these sets of actions, see where that leads you, and then you can change your policy functions at all the different levels of the hierarchy according to how your plan worked out once you start to execute it. So we'll show examples of both reinforcement learning as well as planning in the next two examples. So here's after learning, right? This was based on using reinforcement learning to train three levels of a policy network here. What you'll see here is on the left-hand side, in this one, you can see the reconstruction of what the model is experiencing at any point in time. And that's you can look at that as a perception of the network based on all the accumulated evidence it's seen so far. And then you can see over here the bigger, the bigger scan. The region is being scanned at different locations. And then within that big region, you can see this jumping around. So this is basically the lower level scanning different parts within the upper region, right? And what you're seeing on the right-hand side is the actual image patch that has been scanned, and then this is the prediction based on what is learned in the state transition model. So there's a sequential prediction of what to expect to see next, and that is being used for learning as well as for inference in this case. And the inference is shown on the left-hand side here. You can see how even though there's a lot of jumps, right, there is a stable perception of what it is seeing right now. So as long as it is not seeing anything meaningful, it's going to be empty here. But as it scans that part of the image, it starts to build its model of what that particular object is, right? And one other thing I'll mention here is that this particular kind of accumulation of evidence and perception also explains why when you make eye movements, you would imagine that there's a lot of jumping around going on, right? But at the same time, we feel like the world is stable, right? And the world is stable because there's integration of information going on, just as shown on the left-hand side here. And that keeps our world stable, even though our eyes are jumping around 3 times per second, right? All right, so once you've done that, you can also start to learn these part-whole hierarchies. And this is an interesting problem that people like Jeff Hinton have suggested one should look at. And we can do this here because we have movements that are scanning. So you have coordinates within a reference frame of where the different parts of the object are. So over time, you can learn where the pieces of a big image are located. And we get not just the parts, which are shown at the top, but also the location. So there's a location hierarchy as well as the parts of the object. And finally, compositionality allows you to do zero-shot transfer, as Alex also showed. And the idea here is when you learn the parts of objects, they're clustered in different locations in this two-dimensional projection. And these are the clusters for entire objects over here. They're clustered over here. And once you have these parts that are being learned for explaining these larger objects, you can use those same parts to explain some new complex objects, such as these shown over here, or objects you've never seen before, such as this 8 and a 7 and so on. These classes were not given as training to the model when it was trained. And you can use these different parts. The green and the blue and so on are different parts that it has learned. And now it's putting those parts in different locations to explain the object that is seen. All right. Let's see, how am I doing on time? All right, so I think I'm OK. So the second application I said, so I promised you that I was going to talk about vision and how you can start to learn objects and their parts, but you can also use the same architecture to solve something like planning, right? So suppose I take the canonical reinforcement learning maze navigation problem, this grid world, where you have this big maze. You have an agent blue, shown over here, it's a blue circle. You have these walls, the gray are the walls. And so if your goal is to get to this location from this, the way you would do it is if you train a reinforcement learning agent, it'll try all kinds of actions until it gets to that location. And over many, many hundreds of trials, it'll learn a policy that'll get you from any location here to that green location. So it's a policy that you learn that has to apply to all locations of this maze. What you can do with a hierarchical active predictive coding architecture is if you learn about local areas of this image, so let's suppose you've learned how to navigate in this piece of the world, and this kind of a world, right? So one with a wall over here, another with a wall at the top, right? And if you learned some policies, these are these more abstract actions, such as A1, A2, and A3, to get to different locations within this small piece of the world, right? So you've learned about something about the small piece of the world. Then you can start to apply it to solve these more complex planning problems, right? So now I can say, okay, in this particular area, I can apply policy number 1. So A1 will get me to that location. And then if I apply this action A2 within this part of the world, so it looks like this, so it's going to get me to that location. And then if I recognize this to be similar to this red type of a room, right, then I can apply this policy number A3 to get me to that location. So within just 3 planning steps, so one, in fact, just 2, right? So you're in this location, then 1, 2 actions at the higher level, you can get to that particular location that you want to get, as opposed to doing planning at the lower level, right? So, and this is how you can manage complexities. You can start to reuse these higher level states and higher level actions to plan and solve more complex tasks. And here's just an example of that. So you can see how in order to get there, you can plan using the higher level. And when you execute those policies, you get these lower level actions that will take you to that location. And you can do the usual thing, which is compare it to lower level planning only. And that gives you this increase in the number of planning steps as a function of distance from goal. And of course, if you compare it to some reinforcement learning agent, because it's a planning algorithm at the higher level, you can essentially change the goal. So you can change the goal as many times as you want, and it'll still keep planning and keep getting to the goal state, whereas a reinforcement learning algorithm obviously has to be retrained, right, because it depends on the goal. So the policies have to be retrained every time you change the goal state. So it takes more time to solve the problem. All right, so in the last few minutes that I have, I'm going to talk about something that's a little bit more, I think if you thought what I was talking about so far is speculative, this is a little bit more speculative, right? So what happens at the top of the hierarchy, right? So we talked about how you can have these cortical areas that are computing these sensory motor states and actions. But at the highest level, as we know from the Fellman-Vanneson diagrams, there is the entorhinal cortex talking to the hippocampus, and the hippocampus sending information back to the cortex. And so this makes one wonder, okay, what is really happening here in terms of what the hippocampus is doing and what the cortex is doing, right? So, so inspired by some of the work by Tim Behrens over here and his Tolman-Eichenbaum machine paper, we also were starting to look at what happens if you have an associative memory that does the binding at the very top, right? So we have states and actions that are very explaining what's happening right now. So the kinds of things I've done in the past and the things that I've seen so far, right? That's the states and actions. And if you have an associative memory at the very top that's storing a vector, now the vector is a population of neurons, right? It's representing not just the current time instant, but also the whole sequence of what happened so far. Because as you go higher up, it's generating longer and longer sequences of states and actions, right? And so if that's the kind of model you have, where at the highest level there's an associative memory that's storing different vectors that are encoding for states and actions, so that you have the sequence at the very bottom here. You can start to do some interesting things, like, for example, if I give you only a subset of the sequence, then you can do recall, right? So basically, it'll prime the vectors that are stored in the associative memory, and it'll recall the rest of the sequence. And this was something that we did, and you can look at this PlotsCom bio paper if you're interested, trying to replicate some results from visual cortical recall that were observed in rodent models. And another interesting thing you could do is post-diction, right? So we've been talking about prediction, but there's some really interesting phenomena in perception that are related to something called post-diction, which is exemplified by this color phi phenomenon. So if I physically present these stimuli to you on your retina, so you have a green dot, nothing, nothing, and then a red dot that's displaced, in this case diagonally, right? What your brain constructs is this kind of a sequence. So you perceive it as if the green dot moved from along the diagonal, And you also perceive that the green changed to the red in between, right? And now what's puzzling, and that got philosophers also very puzzled, is the fact that at this point in time, you really haven't seen the red dot yet. So how are you able to change your perception to a red here, even though you have not physically seen that, right? So that seems like a puzzling thing. And this is something that's called post-diction. There's a flash lag effect that some of you may have heard of. It's also related to this particular idea. It all has to do with sequences, right? Sequences of, in this case, visual stimuli. So one interesting suggestion that was made by Haugendorn was that these kinds of results can be explained if perception represents a timeline, not just an instantaneous snapshot of what you're experiencing, but actually a timeline of past, present, and future, right? And so this comes about naturally with this kind of model I just talked about, which is if at the highest level you have a vector that represents not just what you're seeing right now, but a whole sequence, right? It's a sequence of things that have happened in the past, what's happening now, and what's going to happen in the future. Then any kind of error that you get, right, in the middle of the sequence is going to update your vector at the top, which is this M memory vector that's at the top. And that, in turn, can explain some of these post-diction-like effects. So if you're interested, you can look at the Plosscom bio paper. All right, so I'll riff Steve Jobs here saying one more thing, right? And this is a shout out to Max Schein, I think, who's also in the audience. So there's some really interesting, intriguing, I think, predictions one could start to make if you start to think about what's really happening between the cortex and the subcortical areas that are receiving information from the cortex, right? So for example, if you look at the cerebellum and the basal ganglia, right? So in this APC model, you have both states and actions being estimated at different cortical areas. And if one believes that this action estimating cells are projecting, let's say, to the cerebellum, right? Then the feedback from the cerebellum, as shown in this nice diagram here from Mac's paper, comes to what are called the core cells in the thalamus, right? So the thalamus has core cells and matrix cells. And the feedback from the cerebellum comes to the core cells, which in turn go to the middle layers. And if you remember, the middle layers are the sensory receiving layers of the cortex. And so what this suggests is that the actions are being sent, and then there's a sensory prediction, perhaps, being sent from the cerebellum saying, hey, look, here's what I predict is going to happen if you execute this action, right? And that's being used to update the state estimates in this particular module that was sending the information. Similarly, I think the basal ganglia, in this particular diagram, you can see that the outputs of the basal ganglia seem to be going to the matrix cells in the thalamus, which in turn are much more diffuse in terms of their influence, right? So here one could speculate that the outputs from the basal ganglia are being used to influence the kinds of actions being selected during planning. So I mentioned planning. So in planning, you have to explore different kinds of actions at different levels of the hierarchy, and perhaps that's what this could be doing. It's actually trying to promote certain actions and not promote other actions. All right, so let me summarize. So the big picture here is that the neocortex, as many other people have suggested, we're trying to model that as a Bayesian estimator that maintains an internal model of the world. And what's new here is we're suggesting that sensory and motor processes may be much more intimately intertwined than we previously thought. And they may be hierarchically organized in a sensory motor kind of way. So, and that seems to allow us to solve certain problems that occur in the real world. So basically the complexity of the real world. So the real world has very complex dynamics, right? So right now I cannot simulate what every one of you is going to be doing, as you leave or what you're doing now. But if I focus on particular parts and solve them sequentially, I may be able to manage the complexity. And so the idea is you can solve the complexity of the real world using a divide and conquer strategy via compositional representations. And I gave you some examples such as active perception and part-whole learning, navigation and planning. And there's some interesting connections to the TEM model, as I mentioned, including the idea that the same architecture potentially could be used for concept learning. So for example, family trees, if you want to navigate a family tree, right? So if each of the nodes, the states are actually nodes in the family tree, then you can have abstract actions that get you to different locations within this family tree. And that's something that was explored by the TEM model. And also related to this idea that Alex mentioned in terms of arithmetic, right? If you want to add two numbers, then you can imagine the actions in this case as being very abstract. So the addition would be the action applied to two different states of the world, which would be the two different numbers that you're trying to add, right? So again, you could train up these networks that are trying to add and then give you the result of addition. All right, and finally, I think the big take-home message here is that there's an emphasis, in terms of AI, there's an emphasis here on actions, because ultimately our brains evolved to control the body. And so that's something that's been missing in AI, in architectures like the transformer. And so perhaps there's lessons to be learned here from neuroscience, which is that there's a benefit to using this action-first kind of strategy for solving AI, because it leads to this notion of abstract actions as well, which could be used eventually perhaps to learn language, right, which is the most abstract kind of thinking that we have in terms of brains. And so there's lots of open questions here, so your help is needed to solve many of these open questions, and acknowledgements to all the students who worked really hard on many of these examples that we saw, and we brainstormed about many of the ideas here, collaborators as well, and the funders. And please visit us in Seattle. There's a vibrant neuroscience community, and it's always sunny, just as shown here. So.
Okay. Fantastic talk, Raj. That was really thought-provoking. So folks that are interested in asking questions, there are 4 microphones, 2 up here in the front, 2 in the middle.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I might have missed this, but in the navigation system for the model, is it necessary for the timing, the temporal scaling to slow down at consecutive hierarchical levels? And I'm asking because it seems like in the consecutive hierarchical levels, medial septum, hippocampus, and trianal cortex, multiple time scales seem to be existing simultaneously. So I'm curious what your thoughts are. Is time not important? I'm just curious.
No, it's a great question. I think I obviously missed a lot of details here, but let's think about the generative model, right? So the generative model states that there's some high-level episode, right, that consists of both how the world evolves as well as what the actions are that you took, right? And that is, let's say, a vector, right, the M vector that I talked about. And that captures a whole sequence of things. So every level is giving you both a bunch of states because of the state transition function, as well as a bunch of actions to apply to those states, right? And then each level has an elaboration of that particular state into more states at the bottom. So basically, you get this natural hierarchy of time scales. And so that comes about from the generative model itself. Another question is, how do you fix those time scales, right? Yeah. And the fixing of time scales here was done in a very inelegant manner, which is fixed time scales, saying the higher level, for every high level time step, 5 time steps at the lower level, right? Or some fixed number of time steps. But really the way to do it, which people have done in reinforcement learning, is to have that be adaptive, right? So if a goal is met at the lower level, then you transfer control to the higher level again, and then you transition to the higher level. If a goal is met at the higher level, then you transition control to the even higher level, and so on. So you need to have coordination of different levels of hierarchy in terms of the goals are being met at every level. And that's perhaps where you get these different time scales that are also adaptive, right? It wouldn't be a fixed set of time scales. Thank you.
So predictive coding is a beautiful theory. It's been very influential for decades, rather like supersymmetry or string theory in physics. For those of us who work with experimental data from the cortex, it seems to make less contact with the data we see because it just doesn't look like that's what's happening. So my question really has always been, what are the predictions it makes that could potentially falsify the theory? And in particular, my question to you, would you be interested in an adversarial collaboration where we sit down, make some predictions that could potentially falsify the theory, then go do the experiments, and then see what we find?
Thank you. I'm not an adversarial kind of person, but I think that sounds interesting to see, at least discuss what those particular experiments could be. I think there's some very concrete predictions you can make, which is in terms of the feedback connections. If they're modulating the functions at the lower level, if we're able to record from one so-called higher area to a lower area, right? You can make predictions about both what the feedback connections are carrying in terms of modulation of the states, the state networks, as well as the action networks, right? So the superficial layers, the deeper layers, look at how those networks are being modulated by the feedback connections. And those are some of the kinds of predictions one can make that are very tied to the laminar structure. Similarly, the feedback from the thalamus back to the cortex from the subcortical areas, right, like the motor centers, one could start to test whether those are having influence on the cortical dynamics. So there's a Nature Neuroscience perspective article that's coming that we'll talk about some of those predictions. So hopefully, we can chat about that once that comes out. Yeah.
Great.
So they're paying me to be the bad guy. So just to keep us on time, well, let's take one more question while the next speaker's setting up their slides.
I think, Tim, you're next, or? Okay. Oh, okay.
So you mentioned that the timescales are adapting.
Uh-huh.
What about the levels? So you have a hierarchy. What's optimal? How many levels? How many resources should be spent on each level? Is there any quantitative predictions you can make?
No, great question. I think at this point, we were literally setting those levels to see how they all relate to each other. So there was no optimization of the number of levels of the hierarchy. There was one paper I mentioned, just one slide. It's a PNAS Nexus paper, which used a recursive version of this architecture, which is that the same hyper network or the same network that goes from top to the bottom can be reused at multiple levels for an arbitrary number of levels, right? And so that at least gives you a sense of maybe there's perhaps an adaptive way of setting the number of hierarchical levels, if you can reuse the same top-down connection to modulate the functions. So it's like a recursive, sort of almost fractal-like version of this particular network. So there may be ways to do that, but it's still underexplored. But thanks for the question. Thank you.
All right, fantastic job, Raj. Let's thank our speaker again. Yeah? Okay, so next up we have Thomas Liu from Princeton. Thomas.
Thank you. My name is Thomas Lowe. I'm a postdoc with Carlos Brody at Princeton. I'll be talking about transitions in dynamical regime and neural mode underlying perceptual decision-making. Animals often use unreliable sensory information to choose an action, such as when seeking food. This process is referred to as perceptual decision-making. Perceptual decisions depend on the interaction between many neurons within large populations. The question that I wish to address here is how neurons interact within a population to give rise to a perceptual choice. We use a task that requires rats to accumulate evidence over time from auditory clicks and then report whether more clicks are played from the left or the right. The rat performs this task in the chamber with 3 ports and 2 loudspeakers. It begins each trial by inserting its nose into the center port, and while keeping its nose still, the rat listens to 2 simultaneous, randomly timed streams of clicks played from loudspeakers on its left and right. Click, 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 click. The randomly interleaved periods of silence and input are critical for our analysis. At the end of the clicks, the rat turns to the side where more clicks are played for a reward. The rat can respond only after the end of the clicks, and we analyze only the activity before response initiation. Expert rats are highly sensitive to minute differences in the total number of right and left clicks and are reliably correct when the difference is large. Many of the current neural hypotheses are inspired by a successful and popular behavioral model, the drift diffusion model, or the DDM. In the DDM, a decision variable A is driven by both noise and inputs. For a decision between go right and go left, input for right drives A in a positive direction, and input for left drives A in a negative direction. The momentary input is summed in time, sum over time in A until its value reaches a bound, a moment thought to correspond to the transition from deliberation to commitment. After this transition, the rat has made up its mind. A is affected by neither noise nor inputs. A positive bound corresponds to a commitment to go right, and a negative bound to go left. An important question raised by this popular model is whether there's actually an abrupt transition from deliberation to commitment in the brain, and if so, what are the changes that give rise to this transition? The behavioral DDM had inspired what we call the DDM line attractor hypothesis, which posits that neurons interact to restrict their activity to lie along approximately this line or one manifold. A right click moves the activity along the line towards the right bound, and a left click moves the activity towards the left bound. Transient inputs are thereby summed over time by neurons shifting their activity along this line. We refer to the change in the activity in response to a click the input-driven dynamics. For this line to be reliable tally, activity must be stable even during periods of silence. We refer to the change in activity in the absence of clicks to be the autonomous dynamics, which is quantified more precisely in 2 dimensions. Here, each arrow indicates how activity at each location will change. The orientation is the direction of change, and the size the speed. The bigger the arrow, the faster the change. Each arrow is therefore velocity, and this is the decision state's velocity vector field in the absence of input. As mentioned before, inputs move the activity along the line attractor. A second hypothesis posits not a line attractor, but bistable attractors. There's a saddle point in the middle, and to the left and right, 2 basins of attraction corresponding to the 2 choice options. A third hypothesis also posits a line attractor, but the inputs are not aligned to the line and are integrated through non-normal autonomous dynamics. Support for these hypotheses come mostly from behavior, artificial neural nets, and single neuron recordings. It remains debated which, if any of the 3, capture the simultaneous activity of neurons. We address this question by discovering, through an unsupervised method, the velocity vector fields directly from the data. We recorded from 6 interconnected brain regions in frontal cortex and striatum. 3 of these have been tested with perturbations to be involved in our task, including the areas DMFC, FOF, and dorsostriatum. Using 1 probe per rat, we recorded from 2 to 3 brain regions simultaneously from each of 12 rats. Each day, we recorded from a few hundred neurons, as shown here for an example trial. These spike trains are the data on which we do our inference. For the inference, we denote the velocity vector field as a function f that governs the dynamics of the decision state z. F depends also on the clicks, and when added to noise, determines the actual velocity z dot. F is therefore the expected velocity given the z and the clicks. The starting state of the decision is also stochastic and is expected to be at the origin or the center. In this framework, the expected velocity f is most critical for our question. We developed a method to approximate velocity f using a feed-forward neural net. Importantly, we don't interpret any of the parameters within the artificial net, which we use only as a mathematical tool for function approximation and not as a model of the brain. To aid interpretability, Z is low-dimensional. This method was inspired by the work of Chethan and David Sasolo and many others. To dig into this method, please stop by poster number 56, presented by my collaborator Tim Kim. Tim is an exceptionally creative and effective graduate student, and he's looking for a postdoc. We infer the velocity f by maximizing the likelihood of the spikes. Consider a 10 millisecond time window. I count the spikes of a neuron and call the momentary spike count y. Given the z, we model y as a standard generalized linear model, or GLM. This is the measurement model. In the GLM, the decision state is encoded using a weight w that's private to each neuron, and added to a baseline b to regress out components that are relevant to the decision, and pass through a nonlinearity approximating an FI curve. Z is related not just to one neuron, but all n simultaneously recorded neuron, and we validate that the model can well capture the data, which you can see at Tim's poster. Recall that I sketched the 3 hypotheses, assuming that the decision state Z was 2-dimensional. Similarly, 2 dimensions suffice for our model to represent the decision-related activity in our data. Here I'm showing the result for an example session. Let's first consider the velocity in the absence of clicks. The dashed line demarcates the subregion that's well sampled. We were expecting to see a line attractor or an approximation of one, but that's not what the velocity vector field suggests. The slow autonomous dynamics are not one-dimensional, but two-dimensional. Note that the model can find a line attractor from simulated data, supposing a line attractor. We also did not see the distinguishing features of the bistable attractors hypothesis, which consists of a saddle point and 2 basins of attraction. We were particularly surprised by the slow autonomous dynamics in the center, where the decision starts, which contrasts with the strong autonomous dynamics near the periphery. The autonomous dynamics contrast sharply with the input-driven dynamics, which are strong in the center and weak in the periphery. Therefore, we interpret this to indicate that the center and the periphery have different dynamical regimes. the speed of the autonomous dynamics indicate where the dynamics are slow and strong. The speed makes clear the difference in the dynamical regime between the center and the periphery. The regime in the center is input dominant, whereas the regime in the periphery is predominantly autonomous. That is, the clicks having little effect. Also, the strongest autonomous dynamics and the strongest input-driven dynamics point in different directions. To see the implication of the difference in the dynamical regimes, we average trajectories from trials with similar overall evidence. Blue indicates evidence favoring go left, red means go right, and lighter colors indicate weaker evidence contrast. The decision first evolves along the directions of the inputs and form a straight line that's mediated by strong inputs without needing a line attractor in the autonomous dynamics. Later, if the system reaches the periphery, the autonomous dynamics veer the system toward a slow point in either the top right or the lower left, corresponding to the two choice options in our task. The turning occurs right where the input's dynamics weaken in strength. We refer to an axis in neural space as a neural mode. Therefore, the change in the dynamical regime is coordinated with a change in the neural mode. Though entirely derived from neural activity, the input dominant and autonomous dominant regimes are reminiscent of the deliberation and commitment regimes of the popular behavioral DDM. We therefore hypothesize that the coordinated transition in the dynamical regime and the neural mode to underline an abrupt shift from deliberation to commitment. If this hypothesis were true, then a simplified model distilling all this finding should capture many aspects of the data, and having few parameters and therefore greater statistical power should pinpoint the exact moment of the shift from deliberation to commitment. To do this, we simplified the velocity z dot from multidimensional to be one-dimensional, and replaced the artificial net approximating f with a piecewise linear function that depends with two regimes, one that depends on inputs and noise, and one that does not. This is identical to the DDM. This reduces the parameters governing z from about 100,000 to 3. Both models are fit using the same measurement model of the Poisson GLM. The key feature of the simplification concerns the encoding weight w, which is private to each neuron. In the simplified model, each neuron's w is state-dependent. It takes one value when the decision is in the deliberation regime, w sub d, and it takes a different value when it is in the commitment regime, w sub c. At the population level, an abrupt change in the encoding weight at the moment of commitment implements a rapid change in the neural mode. Now, even though each neuron has only two encoding weight and is tied to the same latent decision process, this simplified model well captures diverse temporal profiles, as shown for these 4 example neurons. The shading is the observed trial average aligned to stimulus onset, and the solid line, the model prediction. Compared to the DDM line attractor hypothesis or the bistable attractor hypothesis, separately for each of our brain regions studied, using either the model likelihood or the temporal profile of the goodness of fit of the temporal profiles, the simplified model fits the data better. We're still working on a comparison to the non-normal dynamics hypothesis. Importantly, this simplified model pinpoints a precise moment of commitment. If we rely on only the clicks and the choice, the behavioral estimate is unreliable, as shown by this example trial. But by leveraging the abrupt shift in neural mode as a signature of commitment, and the statistical power provided by the simultaneous spike trains, the neural estimate at the moment of commitment is precise. Not only is the inference precise, it is variable across trials, aligned to the onset of either the stimulus or the animal's movement. We can therefore leverage this precisely known variability to test our hypothesis, which predicts that if the animal commits while the clicks are still playing, the click should cease to affect the animal's choice. Indeed, the weight of the clicks on the choice abruptly ceases after commitment, supporting our hypothesis, quantified by the simplified model, which is that a coordinated transition in dynamical regime and neural mode underlies an abrupt shift from deliberation to commitment. The simplified model captures many other observations. Nonetheless, we see it not as a final model, but just a parsimonious and useful approximation. We are working towards a more general understanding using a richer data set in which 3,000 neurons were recorded simultaneously across 24 regions. Please stop by poster 153 to hear about this. We are examining how the neurally inferred time of commitment affects processing across the brain. This work would not have been possible without Tim Kim, Carlos Brody, and many others. Thank you for your attention.
If your model is able to run in real time or something close to it?
Sorry, the microphone changed as you're talking. Can you repeat?
I'm just curious if your model is able to run in real time.
That would be really cool. And I think, I don't know. I think that would be cool.
I agree.
No, it cannot at this point.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you comment on any differences across brain regions in the dynamics, and striatum versus cortex?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I have this whole section about different brain regions that I didn't put here, but so one of the brain regions, motor cortical region FOF, it looks a little bit more like bistable attractor, and then whereas another brain region, the DMFC, a little bit more front and a little bit more medial, looks a little bit more like the turning thing that I talked about, and that's. We're still in a regime where we just have enough neurons to make these inferences, and we're hoping to use this larger data set to really get at the differences between brain regions.
Okay, I was going to ask, yeah, so in the similar vein, which brain regions or what neural activity was used for the plot, like that time from commitment estimate?
Here we are using we're pulling brain regions together. But anecdotally, we find the best estimate using DMFC, because that's where we see the greatest preponderance of that mode change.
Have you thought about the other type of hypothesis, like, for example, not neuronal, like synaptic integration, or, for example, neuromodulators?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
So you can integrate a signal using a line attractor, but also you can do it, for example, with synaptic plasticity or with short-term plasticity.
So the question is, here we are thinking about computation through the dynamics of the neural activity, shifting their population states together. And Ulises is asking whether short-term synaptic plasticity could give rise to that. And I think so. Right now we're looking at things in the algorithmic level. You could imagine a lower level, a more mechanistic level in which synaptic plasticity, and in the the famous Wang and Wang paper, there is like the synaptic timescale play a role.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Thomas. And let's now please welcome Jian Li from UCSD.
Thank you. So, good morning, everyone. I'm Jian Li from the University of California, San Diego. Today, I'm very delighted to present our work on understanding atypical decision-making behavior with recurrent neural networks. A fundamental goal of neuroscience and cognitive science is to understand the neural basis of adaptive and pathological behavior. Researchers have long strived to develop computational models that can capture the complexities for learning and decision-making. Recently, traditional cognitive models based on normative principles, such as reinforcement learning and Bayesian inference, have been widely used to understand the fundamental principles of adaptive behavior. To analyze humans and animals' behavior, people typically start from simple cognitive models, such as reinforcement learning model, where the state values are updated by reward prediction errors. Then they will perform model comparison. If there are still missing patterns in the data, they will modify existing models by incorporating additional assumptions such as choice biases and value forgetting. This process leads to a cycle of model comparison and handcrafted adjustments. However, such simple and extensible process can also make these models prone to researcher subjectivity, leading to inaccurate descriptions of behavior. An alternative approach is to use artificial neural networks to predict behavior, which have fewer structured assumptions, require less handcrafting, and provide a more flexible framework for modeling behavior and neural activity. However, such increased flexibility also presents new challenges, such as the difficulty in interpreting these networks. In our previous work, I developed a novel modeling framework that combines the flexibility of neural networks and the interpretability of classical cognitive models. We still fit recurrent neural networks as RNNs to subject behavior in reward learning tasks. In contrast to previous work in the literature, we use very small networks, thus a greater interpretability. But these small networks also have very complex dynamics with many parameters, thus a higher flexibility. In that paper, we show that these tiny RNNs can outperform cognitive models on all 8 tasks tested. We then develop an interpretative framework based on discrete dynamical system theory, opening the black box of these neural networks. The dynamical system view provides us with a unified way to compare the cognitive models and our tiny RNNs. They have a very similar structure. The input consists of the previous actions, task states, and reward, which then used to update the internal states of these agents. These internal states then determines the final outputs of the agents, the action policies. The internal states of these models are described by a set of dynamical variables that summarize the prior experience. These models are only different in their way, specifying how each rule specifying how each dynamical variables is updated. For the cognitive models, the dynamical variables are the action values, which are interpretable quantities. For neural networks, the dynamical variables are the neuronal activations that are not constrained to represent any interpretable quantities. We apply this framework to study reward learning behaviors associated with mood disorders. We reanalyze the behavior data set collected by DePasquale on a 2-embedded task featuring real rewards. On each trial of the task, the subject is choosing between a left action A1 and a right action A2. In each block, only a few trials are rewarded. The beta action has a reward probability of 0.08, 0.125, or 0.25, while the other action has a reward probability of 0.05. In total, 101 subjects from a healthy group, a depression group, and a bipolar group completed this task. There are many atypical behavior patterns reported for this data set, such as a tendency to shift actions after a reward and oscillations between 2 actions. What might be the cognitive strategies underlying these atypical behavior patterns? Can these cognitive strategies tell us anything about psychiatry, such as their psychiatric diagnosis? To answer these questions, we fit a series of cognitive models and RNNs to subject behavior in this task. For each individual, we fit 3 cognitive models. Those are model-free IM models that use reward prediction errors to update their action values. The third model-free IM model uses the action preservation component. We also fit tiny RNNs with different number of hidden units, like 1 unit and 2 units. At the group level, we fit a larger RNN that uses choice data from all subjects. We use cross-validation to compare these models. We found that both the group RNNs and the individual tiny RNNs are significantly better than all the classical cognitive models tested. Importantly, the tiny RNNs are significantly better than other cognitive models with the same number of dynamical variables. This suggests that our RNNs can well capture the underlying cognitive dynamics much better than the classical cognitive models. Now, we have better models for describing these reward-learning behaviors. How can we better understand these RNNs? Indeed, a major barrier to the widespread use of these RNNs in cognitive modeling is their limited interpretability. In our previous work, we proposed an interpretative method based on discrete dynamical system theory. Here, we apply a specific version of this dynamical system analysis called logic analysis to our group ions. This logic analysis is fundamental because it can provide a full description about the dynamics of one-dimensional models. Here's the logic plot for one example subject. Each point here is a trial. Let me explain how to read this logic plot. The x-axis is the logic, defined as a logarithmic ratio of the probability of the two actions. A positive logic means that the subject is preferring action A1. A negative logic means that the subject is preferring action A2. The y-axis is the logic change, defined as the differences of logic between two consecutive trials. Let's consider this trial T. The subject has a positive logic, meaning a strong preference for action A1. Then he takes action A1 and receives no reward. This leads to a very negative logic change that is below the diagonal line of y equals minus x, shifting the logic leftwards. Therefore, in the next trial T plus 1, the subject will have a negative logic, meaning a strong preference for action A2. Then he takes action A2 and receives no reward again. This leads to a positive logic change, shifting, that is above the diagonal line, shifting the logic rightward. Therefore, this suggests that the subject is shifting back from action A2 to A1. So the clusters of the blue points below the diagonal line, the clusters of the red points above the diagonal line, show that the subject is repeatedly switching between two actions. This is a fairly strange behavior that is not expected by any classical coordinate models. Here's the logic plot for the standard model-free ion model, and we can see that on this logic plot, taking action A1 and receiving one reward will increase the logic, while taking action A1 and receiving no reward will decrease the logic. We can see how these two strategies are different from each other visually. We can also verify this switching strategy from the choice data of this subject. For example, in the first block, the subject is repeatedly taking action A1, A2, A1, A2, A1, A2. Therefore, the whole block is identified as a switching period. But this is only one subject. Across all subjects, we observe a remarkable degree of individual differences. We can roughly classify this subject into three categories. First, about 5% people are using this switching strategy. Second, about 60% people are using the so-called inverted reward strategy. Typically, when taking action A1 and receiving no reward, this should lead to a negative logic change, but it actually leads to a positive logic change for this subject, suggesting a strong tendency to stay after receiving no reward. Also, when taking action A1 and receiving one reward, it should lead to a positive logic change for the model-free ion model, but it actually leads to a negative logic change for this subject, suggesting a strong tendency to shift after the reward. This tendency to shift after reward is well reflected in the subject choice pattern, such like for these trials. The last strategy is called the mixture strategy, which is a mixture of the previous two strategies. For example, for this subject, it can use the inverted reward strategy for several trials and then alternating to the switching strategy for several other trials. Therefore, the logic plot for this strategy will have both the features from the switching strategy and the features from the inverted reward strategy. We can also validate these insights based on targeted behavior analysis. Due to the time limit, I will not go to the details, but if you are interested, we can talk about it later. Now, how can we use these insights to develop better diagnostic tools for computational psychiatry? Here, we propose to use a specific version of tiny ions called a switching linear recurrent unit to compress these logic patterns into low-dimensional interpretable features. Conceptually, it is similar to use a slope W and an intercept B to compress logic patterns for each trial condition, similar to a linear regression for each color. Using these extracted low-dimensional interpretable features, we can then train a supported vector machine to predict the subject diagnostic labels, the healthy groups, depression, and bipolar. We found that this classifier can reach an accuracy of 55%. that has a similar performance as using a large black box RNN, and they are much better than the classifiers using the features extracted by classical cognitive models, like these model-free ion models. Across all features extracted by our tiny RNNs, we found that the intercept for unrewarded actions are the most important ones. For instance, the intercept for unrewarded action A1 is significantly larger in the healthy group than it in the depression group and the bipolar group, suggesting a potential diagnostic biomarker. To summarize, our RNNs can outperform classical cognitive models in predicting the rewarding behavior in this task. Our logic analysis can further reveal several atypical strategies underlying this behavior, including a switching strategy, an inverted reward strategy, and a mixture of both. These strategies are strikingly different from the traditional view of IL models. Using tiny RNNs, we can then extract interpretable low-dimensional features and use these features to diagnosis for each subject labels. So the unrewarded actions are especially helpful for this purpose. At last, I would like to acknowledge my two collaborators on this project, Zida Jin and Marcelo Mattar, and also my advisory committee members, my lab members, and other collaborators, and also funding and computing support from Kavli Institute and Nautilus. I also want to advertise for my two posters here. So one on human exploitation with Huadong Xiong that is presented yesterday, and another on biologically plausible credit assignment with Marcus Banner that will be presented this afternoon. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, great. While folks are coming up for questions, could the next speaker connect their slides, please? Thank you. I had a question while we're waiting. I was curious, the logit analysis you showed, was there something specific about the tiny RNN architecture that required that for that analysis, or could it be applied to different architectures as well?
So the logit analysis I developed can be applied to like any models that output action probabilities, especially for two actions. So it does not require the structure about the tiny RNNs, and indeed we can change the different architecture of the tiny RNNs and also consider different architecture of the cognitive models.
Really nice work. Okay, so really nice work. So one advantage of interpretable cognitive models that is essentially baked into their very nature is that they can generalize to new conditions because those parameters mean something. So we kind of can predict what's going to happen in a new condition. Did you try to see how well your tiny RNNs generalize, not just in a kind of standard leave one out setting, but when you actually leave whole conditions out, how they generalize to new conditions that they haven't been trained on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we already showed that the dynamical parameters extracted from these tiny RNNs can be like to predict their like symptom scores or the diagnostic labels here. And there are some ongoing work there. We're trying to use the tiny RNNs to derive the parameters that can be used to generalize to predict the behavior in other tasks. So that's ongoing work.
Sounds very exciting. Thanks.
And maybe very quickly, one more question.
I was curious if you compared to another approach that people have used in this space are logistic regression models, where you just have a bunch of weights. So the animal has a strategy that's parameterized as some weights on its past choices and the past stimuli. Does the tiny RNN also outperform that?
Are you thinking about the regression based on the past observations?
Yes.
So the tiny RNNs also outperform that type of models.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
Hello.
Okay. And our last speaker for the session is Ulises Pereira from the Allen Institute for Neural Dynamics.
Hello, everyone. The title of my talk is Mechanisms for Brain-Wide Inter-Area Communication. So during behavior, brain-wide activity change in time and space. Co-activated brain regions at a given moment in time are referred as functional networks. These functional networks communicate to produce behavior. In this talk, I will present a class of multi-regional RNNs that we use to understand this brain-wide inter-area communication. Let us start with thinking about communication between two areas. Taking inspiration from the work by Semedo and colleagues, let us consider a scenario where areas interact through low-dimensional projections, where only select dimensions in one area dynamics are gated to the connected area. We term this communication as static gating of the dynamics, since identical stimuli to an area result in the same signals being gated to the connected area. External inputs, or the effect of neuromodulators, can alter the internal dynamics, as you see here in this cartoon, and consequently leading to a gating of different type of dynamics in the other area, in the connected area. So we refer to this type of gating of signals as a dynamic gating, since you can control the type of the signal that you gate from one area to another one. Another way to achieve dynamic gating is by altering this projection in a time-dependent fashion. For example, as shown in this cartoon. So we're going to model this type of gating using a class of multi-regional RNN. So we model the dynamics within a single area using a mixture of connectivity motifs. So this will be symmetric, asymmetric, and random connectivity motifs. So this type of connectivity motifs will lead to a qualitatively different type of dynamics. For example, the symmetric connectivity motif will lead to attractor dynamics. The asymmetric connectivity motif will lead to a strong transient and sequential activity, and the random connectivity motif will lead to heterogeneity and chaos. So when we mix together in a single network, what we often get is low-dimensional dynamics, and this low-dimensional dynamics is described by a few order parameters, or dynamical order parameters that we call overlaps. So the overlaps is the projection of the population activity into the right vectors of the symmetric and asymmetric connectivity motifs. So in our model, the connection between areas are through low-rank connectivity matrices, as you see here in this cartoon. So, for instance, in this illustration, you see that in area 1, neurons that are connected through asymmetric connectivity project through this rank 1 connectivity matrix to in area 2 to neurons that are connected through a symmetric connectivity. So symmetric connectivity leads to reverberations, lead to fixed point attractors. So when we have this type of a scenario, for example, in this example, the resultant dynamics will be such you see in this cartoon. So first, the dynamic will transient and at some point will be aligned to one of these patterns. And when it's aligned to this pattern side 2, what will happen is that this connectivity bottleneck will read out the activity in the direction side 2, and then will project to another area in this direction eta, and it will lead to attractor dynamics. So if we simulate this type of network, well, we get exactly that, right? So we get that strong transients in area 1, and then we see, if we look at the overlap, so we see sequential activity, and at some point we have this static gating that it will gate that will have a fixed point attractor in the other area. So qualitatively similar, but the same scenario, the same qualitative scenario you get if you do midfield theory approximation, you will get the same qualitative scenario if you add random connectivity or you sparsify these connections. So now, how we really build these large-scale networks, how we incorporate the structural constraint. So we use anatomical data. In this case, in this example, is from macaque cortex. So we use 90 areas. And then we use this anatomical data to constrain the sparsity of the projections. So then we use also this data for looking for subnetworks. So areas that are more connected, we use an unsupervised learning algorithm to define different subnetworks. And we did that because we want to have a proof of concept that you can embed multiple functional networks in this type of whole brain networks. And this is one example, so you can embed multiple of them. And this is one example that we find a prefrontal network. So what we do once we have this network, and in this case, we pick this functional network, and then we connect this functional network that is embedded with other functional networks in this whole cortex network by communicating areas in this prefrontal network by rank 1 projections. And these rank 1 projections will communicate symmetrically connected neurons. So will be symmetrically connected neurons in each area in this prefrontal network will be connected by this low-dimensional bottleneck. So the type of dynamic that we will get in this case, if we want, we will have like low activity, but in other areas, you will have high firing rates. For example, in this case, prefrontal cortex 946V, you see that you have high firing rates, strong fluctuations. And when you see the entire brain, you will see that they will have a gradient of high firing rates, which is not surprising. The fluctuations come from the heterogeneity, and this is chaotic dynamics. We know this from long time ago. So when you look at this overlap, you will see that some areas actually present high overlaps. For example, this area 946V that belongs to this prefrontal cortex subnetwork, this functional network, and then this other area, cingulate area 24D, have zero overlap or close to zero overlap. So the take-home message of this is that you can embed functional network, and this functional network communicate through these connectivity bottlenecks. But if other neurons, other areas have high firing rate, it doesn't mean that they will be communicating. So the geometric view is that you have communication between areas through these bottlenecks, and there is a private direction in other areas that cannot be communicated through these bottlenecks. So now that we know that we can embed these multiple networks in large-scale networks, multiple subnetwork in large-scale networks, we want to understand how this can be applied to functional network in the human brain. So we were particularly interested in how this salient functional network, that is a functional network is active with a salient stimulus, then engage with other functional networks. For example, the dorsal attention network that is involved in task engagement. So how this type of dynamics in functional network can come from our model. So we perform the same type of constraints on the connectivity and also in the heterogeneity of the network using different MRI measures. And then what we found is that, for example, because the salient network have this transient activity, we connect each other with this asymmetric connectivity motif. And then we see that if we give a stimulus is unaligned with this asymmetric connectivity, there is no engagement of the dorsal attention network. Now, if we stimulate with a aligned input, we see that the silent network transiently is active, and then the dorsal attention functional network engage. So there is this bottlenecks in the connectivity that lets pass through information and engage with the functional network, depending on how aligned are with the internal dynamics. Now, another example of dynamic gating that is very interesting is the transformation between motor preparation and motor execution. So in a series study that has been possible to characterize the multi-regional dynamic during delay response task, in which motor preparation needs to be transformed in motor execution after a go cue, as you see here in this plot. In this task, the ALM is part of the motor cortex, have this low-dimensional dynamics during the delay period, and then after a go cue, they have this also low-dimensional dynamic that encode choice, but it's transient. So the question is how to go from motor preparation to motor execution. So this circuit has been exquisitely characterized. Actually, this is a piece of anatomy that is very beautiful. So you see that in the ALM, there are two types of neurons, these pyramidal tract neurons that one of them, the green one project to thalamus, and they are genetically defined, and the pink ones project to the medulla, the output of the circuit. So the green PT neurons actually encode strongly during delay period choice. So have this mnemonic activity that is persistent. And then the pink one, the PT lower neurons, have this choice activity after the GOQ that is transient. So and they code motor execution, and also project to medulla. So how you can explain this type of data? So we built up this model to try to understand this data. So we modeled PT upper as a model that have strongly symmetric connectivity, and then we connected to a thalamus model that doesn't have recurrent connections, and then the PT lower will have this asymmetric connectivity. So then the projection between, as you see here in this cartoon, the projection between PT upper, thalamus, and PT lower will project the symmetric connected neurons to thalamus, and then they will project to the asymmetric connected neurons in the PT lower model. So the type of dynamics so we can show, and this is kind of inspired in Laurelin's Jacob work and also our own work, that these transthalamic pathways, actually, because thalamus, if you assume the thalamus is fast, it will be effectively to add a connectivity matrix that depends on time, depends on stimulus. So effectively, what you're doing is you change this, you're moving this bottleneck. You're moving this bottleneck with subcortical inputs. And what we see in the simulations, and also you can do calculations about this, is that when we give an input to the subcortical, to the thalamus, we see that this persistent activity in the PT upper model lead to transient activity in the PT lower model. So with that, I think that I'm running out of time. So the conclusion is that we have this new multi-regional RNN class of model that I think is helpful to understand multi-regional interactions, and the way that we understand these interactions are not only that brain regions are important, but these bottlenecks, and how these bottlenecks actually can route information in a dynamic way by transthalamic inputs or by neuromodulators. So also that this class of models helps to understand the static and dynamic gating, and our model provides testable experimental prediction for the role of dynamic gating in cortical information flow for the macaque brain, the human brain, and also cell types. So with that, I want to acknowledge, so this is the last piece of work of my postdoc, so it was done in NYU, so I want to acknowledge the people that work with me in this, Xiao-Jing Wang and Sean Froudist-Walsh, and the Schwartz Foundation. I was a postdoc at the Schwartz Foundation. Now I'm at an institute, so we're pushing these ideas in a more data-driven way. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We'll probably have to be brief on questions due to time.
Just a quick question here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit at the very end about the transthalamic gating information. Any thoughts on the basal ganglia as being part of that mediation between cortical areas?
Yeah. So I think that Laurelin also has worked on this. So you can think of the basal ganglia connect to cortically to thalamus and control thalamus, so they can control these transthalamic pathways. And then, for example, valuation information that is encoded in the prefrontal cortex will go to the basal ganglia and then go through this big loop to the transthalamic pathway and then gate actions.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm just curious about the motivation of imposing these constraints on RNNs, which is also a theme that I see quite often. You start with this universal approximator, and eventually, hopefully, if you have these, it will converge to this. I'm just curious, are we doing something wrong with our RNNs? Do we don't have enough data to train them? Why do we need to place these biases from the first place?
I think it's always to... So we pick these symmetric and asymmetric connectivity motifs because they give qualitatively different dynamics. So you have this symmetric connectivity will lead to reverberation, fixed points that are qualitatively different to the transient activity. So you want to understand how this activity is gated, but of course it's kind of ad hoc. But if you train a network, for example, this work by Serge and also this group, that you can show that you train a low rank network and still you can perform a lot of tasks. So it's a way to regularize this network and to have a simple model that you can do computations to. Yeah, but yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, great. Let's thank all of our speakers again. We'll see everybody at 11.